So picking up with Jackson. So we've had the Indian removal in 1830. Jackson has basically abdicated his role as the enforcer of the law, especially the law according to the Supreme Court. Notice there's a subtle nuance there. If you remember reading about Marshall and Marbury v. Madison, the assertion that the Supreme Court decided constitutionality and then it got kicked back to the legislature. This is a belief in strong government, right? This is a federalist idea. And what you see with the Cherokee removal is basically Jackson, saying, no, I don't believe that. It's going to be what I think it's going to be. And he believes that government should, of course, again, he's using government soldiers to forcibly remove Native Americans. So I guess the idea of small government versus big government is in the eye of the beholder. Certainly it fits within Jackson's worldview as far as American Indians are concerned. So we'll be learning more about that as we talk about Jackson. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head. One of the other big problems he has with Calhoun, if you remember me saying, he vetoes a lot of internal improvements. And he gets crossways with Calhoun because he doesn't think Calhoun has a right to criticize him, right? Calhoun doesn't have a right to criticize Jackson or Jackson's administration or the government or tariffs, even though Jackson himself doesn't like tariffs and said that tariffs are the problem for why there's so much sectionalism and division in the country. So he and Calhoun are already not hitting it off very well. It's also not helped by the fact that, Calhoun kind of backed him thinking that that Jackson would be more pliable, more easy to manipulate, and of course Jackson proves not to be. So here's a little, I call this the TMZ moment. This is a lesser known affair, but I think it's very important because it really helps to explain the dysfunction in Washington, D.C. So Andrew Jackson never forgot what happened with his wife, Rachel, right? He saw her as this very pious woman. We can legitimately say that the whole issue with her first husband was all just, the process, the problems with women not having rights and, having an awful first husband and, that there was no intent for bigamy or anything like that. So Jackson had blamed his political enemies for Rachel's death. And he has this very kind of odd where women are kind of on this pedestal, if you will. So women are very pious to him, right? So he has a Secretary of War named John Eaton. John Eaton marries a woman by the name of Peggy. Peggy had her dad owned a tavern there in Washington, D.C. that was frequented by congressmen. She had been married once. Her husband had been in the Navy. He dies at sea, and apparently she does not, appear to be very bothered by this. In fact, she starts dating gentlemen very quickly. In fact, some women would suggest she wasn't just dating them, that she was, escorting them upstairs to her room, if you will. So she is a woman of questionable character, a loose woman. And so John Eaton and Peggy get married, and there's all this kind of drama surrounding her. Were she and John actually a couple before her husband died? And, is she sleeping with people? All this kind of stuff. And so what's going to happen is that kind of the Washington system that Dolly Madison had set up, where the First Lady kind of navigates politics with wives and families and has these dinners and salons and people exchange ideas and build coalitions, right? This is what Dolly Madison had brought in. Well, Jackson doesn't have a wife, first and foremost, so that's already a problem. And so it kind of fell to John C. Calhoun's wife to kind of do that sort of aspect of it, except Calhoun and Jackson don't get along. And then Jackson decides that he really likes Eaton. He thinks Eaton's a great guy. Eaton marries Peggy, and all the other wives of the cabinet members are shocked that he would marry this loose woman, and she's so awful, and all this kind of stuff. And so they're not, they basically refuse to be around her. So this really fractures the Washington, D.C. social scene, where a lot of kind of the soft politics take place. And Jackson really kind of digs in on it. He basically sends Calhoun this nasty letter and says, your wife will accept Peggy Eaton. And basically, Calhoun's wife goes back to South Carolina and says, oh, well, gee, I can't really help you out in Washington, D.C. anymore. And so really the Washington, D.C. social scene shuts down because Jackson is so insulted for John Eaton and Peggy Eaton, and it's all based on his bad feelings about his wife and kind of this perception that everyone should do what he says. And so it's really going to help paralyze his administration that was already struggling, right? He already dealt with a lot of obstruction in Congress. A lot of congressmen didn't care for him, i.e. Henry Clay. John Quincy Adams is back in Congress at this point. And so they really kind of throw a wrench in every policy that manages to even get close. And Jackson's not known for being a good policy guy anyways, right? He just wants to kind of rule by statement. Yes, we're going to remove the Indians or whatever. So Jackson sees this as a political conspiracy, and this makes him very suspicious, makes him overly reliant on his kitchen cabinet, so to speak. And this is going to allow Van Buren to really kind of insinuate himself with Andrew Jackson, make him Andrew Jackson's right-hand man, and it's going to solidify Calhoun as a political enemy. So this whole ridiculous TMZ moment that's based on this reputation of this woman that other ladies don't see as being appropriate to be around, that basically John Eaton married below himself, kind of, that this whole thing triggers this malfunction in Washington, D.C., and really kind of makes Calhoun, who didn't care for Jackson in the first place, now makes him an official enemy that is going to oppose. In fact, Calhoun will resign as vice president and go on to be senator of South Carolina. So you've got a couple of tariff issues. Remember me saying that Jackson argued that tariffs were responsible for sectionalism and that therefore we should lower tariffs. Well, he says that, but Congress passes tariffs in 1828 and again in 1832. And these tariffs are meant to protect manufacturing and provide money for some internal improvements. Maybe not as many as people would like, but a few. And here's the issue. South Carolina is going to get mad because South Carolina is saying tariffs hurt our economy. They make it harder for us to be able to sell our agricultural products. So the tariff of 1828 is going to make South Carolina mad. When the tariff of 1832 passes, South Carolina itself as a state is going to nullify both the 1828 and 1832 tariffs. So they will, as a state, pass a law that says, you know what, those tariffs, we don't have to listen to those. So this is basically the state of South Carolina trying to control commerce. Make no mistake about that. Tariffs control commerce. John C. Calhoun, as vice president at this point, writes the exposition in protest that argues that states are allowed to nullify federal law and that the Union was voluntary. Gee, where have we heard that before? That would be the Kentucky Resolution, right? States can argue that this law does not fit the Constitution, that the Constitution itself is a compact, and the state militia is going to refuse to allow the federal government to collect customs duties on products coming in through South Carolina. Jackson is basically going to say, oh, no, you didn't. He's going to threaten military action and to kind of force South Carolina to comply. And he is then going to, of course, this is the one way in which he does actually do something productive. He reaches out to Henry Clay and he says, hey, we need to do something about this tariff. Now, Henry Clay, who's a Westerner who understands the issue of tariffs, he's kind of a sometimes ally. He does work with Jackson to rewrite the tariff so that this whole issue with South Carolina goes away. Nobody really wants to push this notion of nullification. Nobody wants to go there. And Calhoun has taken the Kentucky Resolution argument a step further, saying that basically South Carolina could choose to secede if they wanted to. And so that's kind of the deal. So Calhoun will then resign as vice president, go on to be a South Carolina senator. And Clay and Calhoun will then balance interests. So Clay and Calhoun, Clay helps Jackson rewrite that tariff. Then Clay and Calhoun will really see Jackson as the threat. and they will act as the counterpoint. So they are kind of his political enemies, if you will. Now, the issue with Clay and Calhoun being balancing the interests and the power of Andrew Jackson is that, remember that Clay and Calhoun are, pro-agriculture. So they don't want a bunch of money going to internal improvements. They don't want high tariffs. So those things get kind of limited. So the nullification crisis is a big deal. This idea of the Kentucky Resolution justifying South Carolina opposing these tariffs, the fact that the tariffs, the sectionalism, that the tariffs were somehow an unfair burden to the South is a kind of a big deal. And so this is kind of a major deal for Jackson. So Jackson's going to, he does side with Union. He doesn't support secession. I think it's important to recognize that with the Hartford Convention and again with the nullification crisis, the country stopped short of endorsing secession. This argument of the Kentucky Resolution doesn't quite seem to make sense just yet. So we go from that crisis to the bank war. Remember that Jackson blamed the bank for economic bubbles and that kind of thing. And, a lot of people, even though they weren't crazy about the Panic of 1819 and they weren't always sure they were crazy about the bank, they typically saw the bank as a requirement for a strong economy. And so Jackson then goes back to Jefferson's argument, if you remember from the Kentucky Resolution, that basically the Bank of the United States is unconstitutional and therefore we shouldn't have it. And so he uses this as a justification to oppose the Bank of the United States. He sees it as something that his political enemies try to use against him. And so he talks a lot. He's very critical of the bank, wants to do away with the bank. The bank's not constitutional. His political enemies, like Clay and Calhoun and Adams and all those people, start saying, well, clearly he doesn't understand. He doesn't care about the economy and all that kind of stuff. Well, the decision is, in 1832, is to try to push the bank issue as an election issue. So they basically reauthorize or bring up for reauthorization the Bank of the United States 4 years early. It wasn't supposed to be reauthorized till 1836. Now, 1832 is a presidential year. Jackson's running for a second term. So Clay, Calhoun, Nicholas Biddle, who's the president of the U.S. Bank, basically say, let's see if we can't hurt Jackson's reelection chances. Again, remember, nobody in Washington, D.C. is really super crazy about Jackson, except for maybe John Eaton and the people in his kitchen cabinet. So they push this through. It passes Congress. It seems like the bank is going to be reauthorized, except guess what? Jackson vetoes the charter. And when he vetoes the charter, he basically says, you know what, I'm going to withdraw all the federal funds out of the Bank of the United States, forces the Treasury Secretary to do this. So he kind of strong arms one of his cabinet members. The Treasury then takes the money out of the Bank of the U.S., puts it into a variety of state banks, and guess what? They're state banks that have, that are friends of Jackson. How convenient, right? Biddle, as kind of a reaction to this, will start to call in all of the Bank of the United States loans, and this will tighten the money supply and cause an economic panic in 1833 and 1834. Now, this economic recession, this panic, will essentially linger throughout the 1830s. So this is a significant deal, right? Congress can't get the override for 1832. They're just short of that. You need 2/3 of Congress to do this, 2/3 of the Senate, rather. And so they end up censoring Jackson, which is basically a way for the Senate to say, we disapprove of what the president has done. And they blame Jackson for having gone too far, for having hurt the economy. So the key concepts here are the feelings about the Bank of the United States, the blame for 1819, the sense that the market economy is somehow unconstitutional and un-American, lots of internal politics with Clay, Calhoun, trying to reauthorize this, Jackson acting unilaterally with a veto, and then basically kind of really irritating Congress for the last time. Now, Jackson will manage to win the 1832 election, so he will have a second term, but the economy is going to stink, okay? You have tightened credit, high interest rates, the economy is much slower. You'll see in 1836, Jackson, and this makes no sense because the 1836 specie order says that Western lands have to be paid for in gold, or money backed by gold. Well, what he's trying to do is stop land speculation. Jackson has decided that land speculation is hurting the American dream, hurting the American farmer, so he wants to do away with that. So he thinks having everything backed by gold is the answer. What that ends up doing is freezing land sales. And it creates a big problem. Then you're going to have these wildcat banks that start printing money that don't have the specie to back it up. That starts getting used. That creates a bunch of inflation. So basically, you have this crazy economy, due in part to the Bank War of 1832, due in part from his assistance in 1836 of buying land with gold, and he just disrupts the national economy. Which was kind of his intent, but the long-term implications are that it actually hurts Jacksonian Democrats, people that believe in farms and land and Western expansion. They're the ones that have trouble because of all of his nonsense with the bank. Remember, the bank provided money for expansion, and this is not happening because Jackson has messed it up. So Jackson is not, again, he has these big ideas that, where he tries to say, I'm right, you're wrong. He doesn't always understand the cause and effect of these policies, and this is why he has trouble. Now, men like Clay and Calhoun have a little more insight. The problem is they're not the best leaders either. I mean, they're good at opposition. I don't know that they're good at leading. Henry Clay will try to run for president like 3 different times and won't be able to win. So in 1832, you're going to see the emergence of the Whig Party. The Whigs are technically the National Republicans. They believe in the same things, but they begin to take the notion of the Whigs, which is a reference to Great Britain, the parliamentary party that opposes the king and the king's agenda. And so they start kind of poking fun at Andrew Jackson, calling him King Andrew. That he vetoes things like internal improvements in the Bank of the United States, and that he threatens force on states, and that he forces the removal of Native Americans, or he refuses to enforce the Supreme Court. Any kind of concept that they could use based on their audience that would appeal to people by saying he's acting like a monarch, so he's a threat to us, right? Again, think in terms of Federalist 10 here. And so the Whigs want an active, stronger federal government. Market economy, stable money supply, very much like we see with the Federalists, okay, if you think about your competing visions document. This is dominated by men like Henry Clay from the West, men like Daniel Webster from like Massachusetts, I think it was, John C. Calhoun, who from South Carolina, even though he has his unique perspectives, he dislikes Jackson enough that he's willing to work with other sections. And John C. Calhoun, in some way, kind of recognized that we have a national economy. Now, he's always in favor of supporting South Carolina, and he'll always side with South Carolina interests, but he doesn't necessarily want to destroy the interests of the West and the North. You also have them really kind of trying to ignore slavery. In fact, they pass a gag rule so that slavery cannot be discussed in Congress. So they have this, so you can't even bring it up, like, to be an issue. Now, this is because you had abolitionists gaining traction by the 1830s and 1840s. So in 1832, Clay is going to compete with Jackson. Clay's with the Whigs, Jackson's with the Democrats. And they're going to have nominating conventions. And you're going to have these kind of things come into play. Jackson will win easily because of the popular vote. And because he gets enough popular vote, he gets the Electoral College. And he's basically going to see that as, well, everybody's thrilled with everything I'm doing. They just are crazy about me. Well, really what it is the popular vote finds him appealing. His, I don't care what anybody says. I'm going to do things my own way. His, kind of throwing a wrench in the way politics is supposed to work. A lot of Americans find that unique. They understand that his attitude, his way of carrying on, appeals to people, and so that's why he's going to win in 1832. You can see this is a famous political cartoon depicting Andrew Jackson as a king. holding a veto in his hand and stepping on the Constitution, kind of disregarding it. So the Democrat and Whig parties are going to be the two primary parties throughout the 1830s and 1840s. We will be talking about the decline of the Whigs and how you have kind of this free-for-all in the late 1840s and 1850s. But the Whigs will be around for a little over a decade, and they will mount kind of this kind of federalist business government kind of attitude about governing, right? So the Democrats will continue to appeal to farmers, factory workers, artisans, and they will try to resist tariffs and the market economy. And they don't like government unless, of course, it allows them to take land from Native Americans. The National Republicans, on the other hand, tend to be supported in the North by merchants and manufacturers. You have some planters and commercial interests who like the strong bank. So you do have some South and Western support, depending on how they feel about a strong economy and the national bank. And a lot of reformers that are going to come about in the 1800s as this market economy produces some uncertainty and we have this middle class and all this kind of stuff. And so the reform movements are going to kind of pick up steam, and they're going to be attracted to the Whig Party because the Whig Party believes in a strong government. The election of 1836, Van Buren, who is kind of the heir to Andrew Jackson and his insanity, he's the architect of the Democratic Party. He's kind of the party boss. He's going to basically win in 1836. He's going to be endorsed by Jackson as continuing Jackson's policies, and he will walk away with this election. It's kind of a challenge, a little more of a challenge than they thought, but the Whigs don't quite have enough organization for 1836. But the economic problems from Jackson, from the bank war and stuff, is going to continue to plague Van Buren. You're going to have a cotton price crash in 1839 that's going to trigger a massive depression in the 1840s. And Van Buren and the Democrats will be blamed. And then you also have this problem with slavery. Okay, and how are we going to divide up the country? It's into this that you're going to see kind of the Texas Revolution happening, and so we'll be kind of talking about that as we kind of go back and look at Western expansion. So the election of 1840, so you don't want to forget this. We'll layer this one with kind of the regionalism part, the Western expansion part. The Whig Party will choose William Henry Harrison. He was connected with, Chief Little Turtle and kind of the Indian revolt. And so he kind of, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So William Henry Harrison, they run a very kind of folksy, home-based kind of campaign, very similar to what Andrew Jackson did. And this is what the Whigs are going to do. So they're going to kind of take a page from what the Democrats were doing. And they blame Martin Van Buren. Of course, you see they call him Martin Van Ruin. And Harrison will win, but he will die shortly after taking office. He'll give a long speech outside, and he'll catch pneumonia. He was already pretty old when he wins the office. So Zachary Tyler is going to come in. And is it Zachary Tyler? John Tyler? I think it's John Tyler. Anyways, is it Zachary Tyler? Okay. I get my Tylers confused. So Tyler's going to become president, and he's going to basically begin to act like a Democrat. So he was the vice president of the Whig platform. The Whigs bring him in with Harrison, thinking to create kind of a broad appeal to kind of your borderline Whigs and your hardcore Whigs, and clearly emphasizing the fact that we're not going to allow secession. We're going to promote, Western expansion, all that kind of stuff. And so Tyler is going to act a lot like Jackson, except he's not Jackson. He doesn't have the personality to pull off, to really kind of get that support. And so he will basically be a lame duck president. He won't be able to work with Congress. He'll annoy them. And so you'll have a lot of economic and political upheaval. And so all of this is going to create questions about territorial expansion and what to do about slavery. And again, this is when Texas gets its independence, and we begin to see the slavery issue really, really, really bubble up. So the topics we'll be covering next will be reform in the 19th century. We'll be touching on Alexis de Tocqueville, as well as on Western expansion. The big concepts I want you to be familiar with are that Jackson is a new type of president. Again, the impact of the popular vote, of expanded suffrage for white males, the less property requirements, and consider the Federalist 10, the notion that this opens us up to a demagogue that can, worries more about factions and less about what's good for the country. And you certainly can see that with Jackson in the way that he conducts himself in D.C. politics with the Eaton affair, the way that he treats Congress and doesn't work with Congress, the fact that, he has these issues, whether it's Indian removal, whether it's opposing internal improvements, whether it's the bank war, whether it's the nullification crisis. You see him behaving in ways that aren't particularly presidential or the way people would have thought of presidential, especially in light of George Washington or even James Monroe. So you've got a lot of real questions about Jackson. Is he a good president? Is he a bad president? Does he do good things or bad things? And this speaks to the very heart of these conflicting visions for America, because people that are very concerned about corruption in government and the market economy are going to look at Jackson as being kind of a hero. You're going to have a lot of people that look at Jackson, people that espouse a great deal of freedom, and we don't trust the government, and the government's going to try to take our property, and government should be as small as possible. Those people are really going to see a resonance with Andrew Jackson that's going to make them see him as kind of the way government should be. He does actually balance the federal budget, but he does so by withdrawing funds from the Bank of the U.S. and crashing the economy. So good thing, bad thing, I don't know. So Jackson has kind of a complicated heritage. Do we want power that is concentrated in the hands of an executive? Do we want a legislative branch that's not capable of standing up to him? Do we want that kind of dysfunction in Washington, D.C.? And what are the impacts? What are the results of that happening? Do we want that to make it so that our country is just kind of muddling along? So there's a lot of profound questions. I'm sure you can probably make some connections with current politics today. So I'll give you a chance in class to kind of ask me a few questions to clear up any loose ends from this, and I'll probably also share a crash course to kind of help layer this a little bit as well. So we'll be working on some documents in class this next week, looking more specifically into Jackson, and you'll be digging into this a little bit more as you start